I was stomping down the side of the road with my thumb up high and my hat down low, eating dust as all the locals passed me by, feeling low as I've ever been when a man pulled up and said, "Climb on in." Said, "Where you going?" I just looked up to the sky. Said I was told this was the road to wisdom. This don't look like wisdom to me. Said, "By George, I think you're right. You missed the wisdom sign, and now you find yourself in opportunity."
The state of Montana is also known as Big Sky Country, the Treasure State, the Land of Shining Mountains, the Last Best Place, and the teepee capital of the world. Montana covers more than 147,000 square miles, making it the fourth largest state in the U.S. But in terms of population density, it ranks 48th out of the 50 states. If they're very diligent, the 2010 census takers might find 1 million people in the state. Historically, Montana's economy has depended on forestry, mining, ranching, and farming, but things are changing. Montana's single largest industry is still agriculture, with beef and wheat as its two largest commodities. Now, however, its second largest industry is tourism. And while it doesn't pack quite the same punch, craft brewing adds value to both of these economic engines, producing over 2 million gallons of beer each year and generating $20 million in revenue in the process. Since the first settlers arrived at the St. Mary's Mission in the mid-19th century, Montanans have loved beer. They love making it, sharing it, talking about it, and drinking it. In this film, we investigate the historic, economic, cultural, and aesthetic values that make Montana America's own beer country.
Every culture, historically, nearly every culture on Earth has developed some kind of fermented beverage. What we can tell is at least the first record of any kind of fermentation of anything was the ancient Mesopotamians and honey. And of course honey is now used in the making of mead, and so that was 4,000 years ago. In colonial America, by the 17th and 18th century, people are brewing different styles of beer based on their environment, their local environment, and their communities. And then, of course, by the time we get to the late 19th century, you have millions of people again coming from Europe, huge waves of immigrants coming, and they're bringing, their brewing styles with them and their craftsmanship, and it's all very local and all very, sort of culturally centered, ethnically centered, and it's part of people's, like food, it's part of people's culture.
Right from the very start, Montana has had a beer tradition, and thankfully that continues even today with the large number of microbreweries that follow that tradition that really started in Montana in 1859, when miners, loggers, and cowboys came to Montana. They came from beer traditions, and especially the Irish and the Germans. My family, the Lozar side of my family, immigrated from Slovenia in the 1800s, and my great-grandfather was a saloon man in East Helena. He was, as soon as he got to America, was associated with Nick Kessler and the Kessler Brewery. The breweries built up around those enclaves of people from whatever country they came from. And East Helena was Slovene. They had a wonderful association with the Kessler family. And so that was the beer of choice in the 11 saloons in East Helena. But Helena had a number of breweries, and they also specialized in beer for the taste of the ethnic neighborhoods in their towns. And Butte is another good example where the ethnicity of the town was built around people who really immigrants that wanted to be Americans and yet lived together in their towns and cities in those enclaves where things were familiar to them in the old country.
You know, in the 1880s, you could walk down the street in Butte and get a fresh Guinness Stout.
Highlander and Great Falls, the two bigger Montana breweries, were paying under the table to the barkeeps in western Montana to push their beer, and Helena or Missoula and Great Falls were both doing that, and Anheuser-Busch was doing the same thing. So each level down, they kept promoting in kind of an underhanded way. So Highlander and Great Falls put out some of their Montana buddies in brewing, and then Anheuser-Busch did the same thing to them in Schlitz and Pabst and some of the bigger breweries. So it was just kind of a long slide of demise to those smaller breweries using the same techniques, and eventually we got down in the 70s to 17 breweries in the country, and that's from about 1700 before 1919, and so the government with Prohibition wiped out a huge amount of the brewing industry in the state, but then so did competition from just the hard dollar.
From 1919 to the late 1970s, beer production in the United States was dominated by a few large breweries and essentially one style of beer. A light Czech Pilsner sold nationwide under such brand names as Budweiser, Miller, Coors, and Pabst. However, thanks to a series of legal, economic, and socio-cultural changes that have occurred during the past 3 decades, American brewing has experienced a consumer-driven renaissance. This is especially true in the state of Montana.
Homebrewing itself was illegal until the late 1970s. Jimmy Carter actually signed legislation that legalized it, and so you start seeing people slowly but surely, trying to find the ingredients. Kind of hard to find malting barley and hops and things like that unless you grew them yourself or knew somebody in the business where you could get it. But in the early 1980s, particularly out on the West Coast, you start seeing craft brewers such as Grant in Yakima, Washington, and the Red Hook Brewing Company in Seattle, and several other ones begin to revive this process of earlier regional craft brewing. And eventually, it'll make its way into Montana by the late 1980s, and particularly it's going to take hold in the bigger communities of Bozeman and Missoula, the college towns, where there's a lot of drinking already associated with the local cultures. And also in Helena, too. Kessler Brewing Company reopened in the mid-1980s and began brewing beer, again, craft beer, and distributing it around Montana. You start seeing brewing in Montana like that, and people like the Anchor Brewing Company in California that will distribute into Montana. And I think what happened was, over about 10 years, people's palates simply got much more accustomed to this kind of beer, and for many people now, it's the beer of choice. You get more and more people, young people who, that's the kind of beer then that they're accustomed to as they, come of beer drinking age, and you have young people then who become young professionals and who take up the challenge of home brewing or take up the hobby. And then, for instance, my friend George, who we're going to go visit here, he was a home brewer. He's a geochemist, so he knows water, and for years he was a home brewer, and then he decided, I'm just going to take it to the next level and try to turn on as many people, all of my friends and my community as well, to this kind of beer, because there's a market for it now, and I can do it and make money off of it. And so that's, as far as I can tell, as far as I could tell you, that's sort of a compressed history of all of this.
The result of so many people being turned on to George's and other handmade beers is that, as of 2008, Montana now has the second highest number of breweries per capita in the country. Powerhouse brewing states such as Colorado, Washington, and California all have far more breweries, but Montana has 27 licensed commercial operations in a state with fewer than 1 million people. What's even more impressive is that all of these operations are legally classified as craft breweries, meaning that they produce no more than 60,000 barrels of beer apiece per year. And most produce fewer than 10,000 barrels annually in order to comply with the state's tasting room regulations. Montana's breweries are concentrated in the population centers around Billings, Helena, Bozeman, and Missoula, but also thrive in small towns such as Stevensville, Red Lodge, and Webo.
The development of these microbreweries is probably the best example of value added that the state of Montana can offer in any area. And this is something that, is very important to our governor, Governor Schweitzer, because he's a farmer. And so what do farmers do? They plant seeds in the ground, they take that seed all the way up to where they harvest it. Wouldn't it be great if they could add value to that particular product and actually produce the bread or the flour? That's what Governor Schweitzer has been trying to do in the state of Montana, and that's what these microbreweries do. They do it every day.
In the early years of the 21st century, there has been a sea change in many American consumers' thinking about where certain products, especially their food, comes from. One result of this paradigm shift has been a growing consumer movement towards community-based food systems, in which foods are grown, processed, and consumed within relatively constrained geographic and economic regions. We see evidence of this movement in the growth of home and community gardens, backyard chicken farming, farmers markets, and educational programs.
I would like to have hops growing in my chicken coop. But what if the chickens
Eat the hops?
eat hops?
Oh, you'd have beer like
I doubt
eggs.
it, because they're really bitter eggs. I would be so down.
Banks?
I would be
You'd
so
have
down on that.
In addition to self-production, locally and regionally based commercial producers are experiencing a boom as well, thanks to this consumer movement. Montana's breweries offer a perfect example of these effects. Even during the Great Recession that began in 2007, this is an industry that continues to grow statewide. The growth of the craft brewing industry highlights the social and economic impact that people's support of hometown businesses has had on the communities in which they are built.
Montana, according to my information, was the last state in the union to be able to have a brew pub law. Every other state had them. But we produce all the grain. We produce some of the best grain. That's why we've got Anheuser-Busch and Coors and all these big companies that want to buy up all our grain and our barley. And so the question was, why can't we enjoy those benefits? It took a long time. Now, I've got to tell you, I was a legislator for almost 30 years. I was the one that carried these bills to allow microbreweries, and year after year they were killed, they were shot down, until finally in 1999 we got a bill passed. And the stalemate was broken, microbreweries were allowed, and now the people of Montana can enjoy some beer, and now communities all across the state can enjoy the economic benefits of value-added, seed-to-sip, microbrew beer, Montana beer.
What it is achieving is broadening people's understanding of what's available in the world of beer, which in turn then would increase the amount of spending that's going into the beer market, but just specifically the specialty beer market or the microbrewed beer market, which is growing every year. It now represents close to 3% of all beer sales in the U.S. are considered craft brew, and that's a figure that's been continually growing for 15 to 20 years now. And so definitely the amount of money that people are willing to invest in beer is increasing, and their interest in it is increasing, which is what's fueling the fact that we have 4 breweries here just in Billings, where rewind 15 years and there were 0. So, as far as the amount of money that's flowing through any of the participants' hands, Nobody's getting rich doing this. You know, it really is a labor of love. But if you work hard and, you know, do a decent job of producing a drinkable beer, you can make a living doing it and be doing something you enjoy, which is more important than money any day. So.
I remember we had a delegation from Kyrgyzstan, right? One of the little countries that used to be part of Russia. And they got into the Blackfoot River stock, and they like to have it for lunch, you know. They like to have vodka for lunch too, but they thought that was just tremendous beer. And so that sort of made us proud.
These guys came in from, I don't know if it was Holland or something, and they had Googled microbreweries, and our name happened to pop up, and they were coming to Yellowstone Park. So I mean, they came in and, you know, hey, we're from Holland or whatever. I was like, man, how did you guys find us? And, the internet's been huge deal for microbreweries.
I know that one of my friends who used to write for one of the weeklies got to tour around to every brewery and sample them all, and geez, that sounds like it might be a pretty good little vacation.
In July 2009, the Brewers Association reported that there were 1,525 breweries in the United States, the highest number in the past century. Nevertheless, overall U.S. beer sales fell by 2.2% in 2009, and during the first 6 months of the year, sales of imported beers dropped by 9.5%. However, during that same period, craft brew sales grew 5% by volume and 9% by dollars. Sales of craft brewed beer generated $6.3 billion in sales in the U.S. in 2008.
Our cold smoke is dark and rich, but people love it. I get people that are Miller Lite drinkers that, have switched almost wholeheartedly. Years and years of nothing but Miller Lite, and somebody gets them to try cold smoke, and all of a sudden they can't get enough cold smoke. So that's why we're building the new brewery, because it's really taken off. We thought, you know, we'd see an increase in production because we have cans out there. And I had X amount of extra capacity. So, but at the same time, cold smoke, the brand was really taking off in popularity, so in the bars and restaurants. So I didn't account for that, and we are about 2 years behind where we should be if I'd have known, you know, for expanding. And now this place is going to be too small in 2 years. So unless, you know, the whole world falls apart, but people keep drinking beer, so even while the world's falling apart.
You know, if we could add value to every Montana product the way we add value to microbrewery beer, Montana could be leading this world in economics. Maybe the stock market would look out here.
Big breweries and distributors have responded to consumer demand for handcrafted beers by coming out with their own versions of microbrew type products. Budweiser introduced its Amber American Ale in September of 2008 to compete with offerings from smaller craft breweries, and is advertising this product in trade papers such as the Rocky Mountain Brewing News. In January 2009, Costco Wholesale Club began selling 4 styles of contract brewed beers under its Kirkland House label. And despite the label saying that it's brewed by the Blue Moon Brewing Company, Blue Moon beer is and always has been a Coors product.
We have a small marketing budget, and the best marketing is beer to mouth or word to mouth. So for me, it's beer to mouth because people can see it, taste it, and make up their minds right then and there. And that's what we have at the tap room. We have one-on-one contact with our customer or potential customer, and you don't get that anywhere else.
I think in the craft brew place, everybody's welcome. And I don't really see it as elitist or snobbish or anything like that.
It's a different atmosphere. And that's why it's very comfortable. I mean, even my wife will go, you know.
As far as microbreweries, no.
What about the tasting rooms during that?
Yeah, I mean, like Angry Hanks and things like that, been there bunches of times.
You're going to meet from the community from Missoula all the way to Whitefish, or even beyond, politicians, construction workers, cowboys, dancers and entertainers, magazine writers, school children. It's fun, and everyone comes here to hang out.
So we drove down here from Missoula to come down here and eat and just drink beer and hang out.
I have been in brew pubs across the state, and you know, we're not a pretentious hipster kind of douchebag kind of we don't have that big a community of those people here. Now maybe that's different in Bozeman.
I was looking at the list of the big executives that made the big salaries. Saw a couple of them in the last time I was in there. Some people that just come right out of the woods from thinning brush. You know, especially people that have been riding their mountain bikes or climbing Mount Helena. You know, they may come in there with their sweat clothes on. Everybody is down there, and at any table you could see any mix of people. And boy, it's not too long. People are pretty gregarious.
And you've got a different kind of crowd that comes down to enjoy craft beer rather than a sort of smoky, you know, gin and tonic, whiskey kind of bar crowd on Saturday nights. And it's family friendly and sort of soft drinks as well for kids. And so
there's always 3 or 4 babies there and 6 to 10 dogs.
Babies, and it's just sort of and you've always got also, as I said, lawyers and doctors and professionals and college kids and blue collar people and you know, office workers and stay-at-home moms. It's really has become sort of a community gathering place, and of course the center of it all is this great craft beer.
I wish you all could go down to one of the local brew pubs with the governor. You go in with Brian Schweitzer, you will have a good time.
I find them quite unique. You know, I'm offended when somebody calls it a bar, because it's not, it's a tap room. It's got its own atmosphere that goes on there.
Every night it's packed, and so it's kind of fun to come down and see people using my bar, even though it's Tim's beer.
I know that at least the one brewery here allows dogs, and they don't let them drink, and they don't let them drive. But
We tried an open dog policy, and it turned to be a disaster. So we kept it to an employee dog only, and all the employee dogs get along quite fine. No, I think our crowd's a lot, you know, super laid back, super friendly, super fun. Everybody wants to know each other. Everybody wants to hang out. You have a couple beers. Everybody seems to know each other by the end of the day. It's almost like a Cheers establishment is what it would be more like. You come in, everybody seems to know each other's name, especially all the guys sitting at the mugs in the bar. Definitely just laid back. Haven't had any fights, haven't had any destruction. Nobody seems to ever want to just do nothing more than just have a beer.
Or 3.
Or 3.
Uh-huh.
Definitely 3.
The coffee house or the coffee shops, they seem to be a very introverted community, a very introverted environment, while the tasting rooms in Montana, including this one, are very extroverted in nature.
Montana's brewers take pride in the flavors of their products, and these flavors extend to the tap rooms themselves. Each brewery in Montana is uniquely beautiful. Some provide modern and glossy places for people to meet for a drink, and others emphasize their industrial or agricultural origins. All of these tasting rooms reflect the people who make up these communities and the people who have come before them.
This building that we're in used to be an old pea cannery, or part of the old pea cannery, and when it burned down about 20 years ago, whatever was left they just kind of pushed into the crawl space and built on top of it. So being nosy, I guess, I was crawling around in the crawl space, found all this old wood, and we used it to build the bar. These screens are what they used for sorting the peas, cleaning and sorting the peas. So we pulled those up and used those as part of the bar decoration. The light covers up here were also part of the pea cannery. They were actually chutes that the peas ran through. I don't know exactly in what fashion. The chain that is hanging was part of what help to drive the machinery. So we tried to use as much of what was already here as possible.
I wanted a traditional style logo. I went into the local museum and down into the basement, into the archives, and started pulling old labels from different products that were produced here way back when. You know, beets and apples, and that font actually came off of a pumpkin can. So they used to grow and can pumpkin here, bitterroot pumpkin. So that's what I pulled that primary bitterroot from. And then of course I wanted the bitterroot flowers. That the concept for that basic artwork came out of a book. A gentleman that lived here for many years and wrote a book called My Bitterroot. Went into there and looked at some of his drawings and kind of used that as our model to get the whole plant with the root. And then of course the hops and barley were just kind of a natural part of it.
This is our Frisbee. This is a Frisbee of our Bozone Select logo. And the Bozone Select logo came from parts and pieces of old defunct Montana breweries. The B we borrowed from the old Billings Brewing Company. The tail and the E came from Highlander Brewing, which was out of Missoula. The Select came from Great Falls Select out of Great Falls. The circular company crest at the top came from, I believe it was Capital Brewing out of Helena. The brewing tools at the top are just classic brewing tools that have been featured in many historic brewery logo. And then the banner there again is also just from classic brewing logos.
In the traditional sense, the French word terroir means that a product such as wine contains the essence of the place where it was made, the soil, the sunlight, the rain, the shape of the land. If we could apply the term to Montana beers, we'd say that terroir also captures the people who make them and the people who drink them. Montanans have a sense of beer, just as Southerners have a sense of barbecue, and New Yorkers have a sense of pizza. These creations aren't fancy, and these consumers' food sense shouldn't be mistaken for snobbery. It's really just the knowledge that simple, basic foods can be delicious and wondrous in their variety. As anthropologist Heather Paxson writes, in its American incarnation, terroir isn't something to discover, it's something to do. As Americans return to a closer understanding of where their food comes from and who has made it, this sense of food, this human terroir, gains importance on a larger scale. These foods can be distributed as value-added products to consumers who literally hunger and thirst for authenticity. Craft brewers preserve and extend cultural food traditions that have historically united people. And small breweries are economically generative, supporting not only themselves, but people and institutions, small and large, who rely on them as cornerstones of their communities. The Montana Brewers Association states that its members are devoted to the communities in which they live and are dedicated to contributing to them whenever possible. Across Montana, breweries function as third places, public gathering spots that encourage interaction and foster relationships among the people who visit them. As a general practice, Montana's brewers are unfailingly generous in their support of local causes. They realize that their neighbors are their customers, are their friends.